not negotiable. We have to head to 1.5. Both the Liberal document and the NDP document claim they want to hold global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. That means that we have to have all hands on deck in a nonpartisan fashion. So as NGOs around the world and politicians in the United States sees something called the Green New Deal, we like the language, we like the moment, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wonderful public works program to lift the U.S. economy out of the desperation that it was in and the Great Depression is not really the model on which we are drawing for our plan, which we call Mission Possible. Some might think it's mission impossible to do what's required, but we have crunched the numbers. It's mission possible. We can do it. Now, clearly, in an election year, there'll be far more details and a fully costed budget, and we will have it submitted to the Parliamentary Budget Office in our platform. So let me just differentiate. This is the bold strokes of what is required. We hope that just as we've pushed them today to say it is a national emergency, we're in a climate emergency. We all agree on that. Potentially, obviously not Mr. Scheer at this moment, but I just came from a meeting where Michael Chong assured a large group of folks that the Conservative climate plan would be out in 3 weeks. So things are shaking on this issue. We want to set the bar where it needs to be. If other parties want to take our language and take our rhetoric, feel free to take our plan. It must be done, and it's best done in a nonpartisan fashion. So let me just say what it means if we say we're serious about this and it's mission possible. Again, ours is drawn less from the U.S. experience in the Depression and more from a wartime footing as Canada experienced it, as the UK experienced it. The first thing I would do as Prime Minister in this country is create an inner cabinet modeled on what happened in the Second World War, which got called a war cabinet. We are in a climate emergency. Climate change is not, I want to repeat that, not an environmental issue. It's a massive security threat. And it needs to be dealt with by government at all levels as a security threat that requires taking bold action. It's best done, if we can possibly do it, in a nonpartisan way, which is why, in a time of war, the opposition parties were invited into the inner cabinet to make sure that decisions were taken and were not subject to becoming political footballs. The targets, which are absent from the other parties' motions before the House this week, the target that is required for Canada is a 60% reduction in greenhouse gases below 2005 levels to be achieved by 2030. Anyone familiar with the target under which Stephen Harper operated, which is the same target under which Prime Minister Trudeau is operating, will recognize quickly that that's a doubling. We know that currently we're not on track to hit 30% below 2005 by 2030. The target that's required is 60%. That means also it puts us in a position to assume global leadership, to go into the next COPs and to say to the other countries around the world, who frankly are doing far more than we are, you also need to improve your targets. We have to do this together. Where we're headed with this 20-point plan, and there are many elements to it, starts with greening the grid. Our electricity needs to be 100% renewable. Decarbonize is the buzzword for policy wonks, but basically take all fossil fuels out of electricity. And that means also modernizing our electricity grid. This is a big project for infrastructure. We need to make sure that you can wheel green and renewable power from British Columbia into Alberta till Alberta is 100% renewable itself. It means no new fossil fuel wells opened up, no fracking, no new sources of fossil fuels as we move off fossil fuels. But as we move off fossil fuels, we should only be using Canadian fossil fuels till 2050, which means shutting off imported oil from coming into Canada from Venezuela, Kazakhstan, the United States, Saudi Arabia. We will use domestic oil and gas and diesel as long as we are using them. We'll also build up a massive infrastructure for biodiesel produced from not crops grown to produce a bioethanol, but from used existing sources of used vegetable oil. And I'm going to turn it over to Paul Manley to talk about what we're going to do to get Canada back on track and the national building retrofit, which I didn't tell him ahead of time he was going to do, but he's good at that.
So we have all the technology that we need to be transitioning we have Caterpillar has designed battery-operated excavators that can be used anywhere near the grid. We have electric ferries in Norway and Sweden. We have EVs that have been developed, and what we need is plug-in technology across the country so that people can drive from one end of this country to another with an EV. We need to get Canada back on track for via rail and expand service and ensure transmodal connections across Canada in light rail and electric buses, and so that rural communities are connected to urban centres and there's more efficient and affordable, safe public transit. We need to complete national building retrofits, and this will create millions of new well-paying jobs in the trades by retrofitting every building in Canada. Residential, commercial, institutional, they all need to be carbon neutral, and we can get this done by 2030. So we need to bring back the programs that we had in the 10, 15 years ago to incentivize this for everybody, landlords, residential homeowners. As Elizabeth was saying, we need to turn off the tap for oil imports, use what we have here to service Canadian needs. And as we work on transitioning people who work in the oil industry, those jobs are they're transferable. People have transferable skills that we need to get them moved into the new energy economy and create new partnerships for renewables. And these partnerships with Indigenous people, providing economic opportunities by ramping up renewables on their land, harnessing abandoned oil wells wherever feasible for geothermal energy, using workers who drilled the wells to manage renewable energy generation. Call for all hands on deck, engage every municipality, community organization, as well as every school and university to step up, plant trees, install solar panels, heat pumps, assist in retrofitting buildings to maximize energy efficiency. And this is something I did with the nonprofit that I worked for in Nanaimo. It's an energy efficient building. It's a model of energy efficiency. It's now a solar demonstration site, and we're working on getting ourselves off the frack pipe. Call for all prioritizing adaptation, so invest significant resources in adaptation measures to protect Canadian resource sectors such as agriculture, fishing, forestry from the ravages of climate change. Review all infrastructure investments for adaptation to climate change, map floodplains, tornado corridors, and other areas of natural vulnerability, and adjust land use plans accordingly. And change the planes. Cancel the purchase of F-35s and buy more water bombers to protect communities from forest fires. Cut standing dead timber to establish fire breaks and save lives. Curtail other greenhouse gas sources. Address fossil fuel use that falls outside the Paris Agreement. Emissions from international shipping, aviation, and the military. And restore carbon sinks. Launch a global effort to restore carbon sinks, focusing on replanting forests and restoring the planet's mangrove forests as quickly as possible.
And there's reasoning behind every one of these measures. I want to stress again that this is also saying you cannot have climate justice without social justice, that the plan we're putting forward includes some important improvements to the social safety net, including pharmacare, including guaranteed livable income, including justice to Indigenous peoples. So what we are assuring those folks across Canada who are clamoring for where is Canada's Green New Deal, well, the U.S. Green New Deal is very U.S.-focused. One of their bold steps is to have universal health care. Well, we have universal health care. This is a plan that's made in Canada, for Canada, because Canadians can and our government must do what's necessary for Canada to be in a position globally, to be in the lead globally, to move other countries to do what needs to be done. I think my time for the opening statement has expired. Unlike the old press theater, there's no clock in here. And you know this building is so weird. They didn't build it high enough to put the flags in, if any of the media is wondering why we don't have flags anymore. Anyway, other than griping about the new building, we're happy to take any questions.
Just one moment. We have 15 minutes for questions.
Sorry.
We do have an 11 o'clock press conference.
Oh, sorry. Well, I can. Okay, sorry. Alex, then Julie. Alex, I'll answer quickly.
On the pricing, would you maintain the current system, including the exemptions in the OBPS, or would you change that at all?
I would rather, Green Party policy is for fee and dividend, for a clean, clear, simple, revenue neutral approach. But what we want to do here is be all hands on deck. So if the carbon pricing is in place and it's working, I would rather move ahead with other measures that are more meaningful. Carbon pricing by itself is just one small measure. Eliminating subsidies is much more important than to go back and rework something that's already in place. We're practical. We don't have a lot of time, and we don't want to get into ongoing wars over carbon pricing if they can be avoided. And Julie, I said first, and then I'm sorry, John.
You said you want to set up a war cabinet because climate change is a security issue, not an environmental issue. So what do you mean by that?
What I mean by it is that one of the reasons that governments have failed, and not just in Canada, one of the reasons we are failing to address the climate crisis is that partisan politics gets in the way. We've now been delivered the kind of sobering news that ought to get leaders to sober up. We're facing something as dire as the loss of civilization, and that's not the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is massive extinctions. So it's time to get serious. And the last time I can find in the annals of our civilization, our memories, and of course for younger people it's not a memory. My dad grew up in London being bombed in the Blitz. You go back and look at what happened in May 1940, and Churchill and his cabinet nearly surrendered to Hitler. These were tough times. How did they operate? They got rid of the politics. They decided there's an inner cabinet. It's got, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. You're going to work this out together so it's not vulnerable to being a political football, so that at the end of the next election, whatever just happened gets canceled and you start over again. In other words, you take this issue seriously enough to say, we have to do this together. We're not scoring points off each other anymore.
So you'd include other parties
Oh,
in this
yes.
inner cabinet. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. The other parties would be invited to join in an inner cabinet to ensure that, as we did during the Second World War, Mackenzie King had a war cabinet, Winston Churchill had a war cabinet. I don't think war cabinet is exactly the right term, survival cabinet, but it needs to be dealt with as a nonpartisan issue. By the way, we did have a press conference in this space earlier this year. Pierre Nantel from the NDP liked my proposal for a war cabinet, wrote to all the leaders to ask them to join. So Jagmeet Singh has already agreed to this idea of a war cabinet, and not yet the Liberals or the Conservatives or Monsieur Bernier. But the Bloc is also interested in the idea because you need to take this issue seriously. Sorry, John.
You talk about turning off the taps on foreign imports. Most of the foreign imports are coming into the east. Mm-hmm. How are you going to get the domestic fuel from the west to the east?
Well, first of all, it's a very important question. There are 700,000 barrels of oil a day being delivered to eastern Canada, and we're having these very divisive battles over a pipeline that doesn't make any economic sense, which is Trans Mountain Expansion for 590,000 barrels of raw bitumen to be shipped to other countries. If we had upgraders working with refineries in Alberta, we'd create more jobs, good, solid, good wage jobs in solid unions in Alberta. And frankly, shipping refined product does not pose the environmental threats that shipping dilbit does. I've always said, don't ask me if I'm for or against a pipeline. Tell me what's in the pipeline. If you're shipping refined gasoline by pipeline, it's much, much safer if there's a spill because it doesn't sink into the ground. It doesn't separate the way dilbit does. The environment recovers quite quickly. And you also have to use very high-quality pipelines for anything refined because any contamination wrecks the product.
But who is going to build a refinery when the plan is to be off oil by 2050?
Well, there are existing refineries. What there aren't are sufficient upgraders working with those refineries in order to process bitumen, which is why the argument has been put to Canadians that somehow those of us who care about climate action don't want Alberta oil to get to market. Our argument is simple. The market is here. Canadians should be prepared to spend more because, frankly, upgrading bitumen isn't cheap. The product may be more expensive, and certainly the reason that the Irving refinery in St. John is the only refinery buying Saudi Arabian oil is that Saudi Arabian oil is a lot cheaper and doesn't need to be upgraded and can go right into their refinery. So we'd be looking at shifting refining. Certainly this would involve a shift in refining capacity. I don't know if you want to comment on that. Paul's been involved as a director of his co-op, and there is one federated co-op owned refinery in Saskatchewan that built the upgrader so that we could actually have value added to bitumen in Canada and more jobs here. I know I'm running out of time, so Tom.
Very quickly, some technical questions, please. This is a pie-in-the-sky wish list, or are these conditions of your support for any minority government in the 43rd Parliament?
We would never prop up any government in any parliament that wasn't committed to serious climate action. Right? So if you're going to miss 1.5 and you're going to miss 2 degrees, but you claim you're climate leaders because you have the right rhetoric, all you're doing is losing more slowly, but you don't protect your children's future. And this is not something that's negotiable.
A national east-west electricity grid, no fossil fuel generation. There is no national east-to-west grid. Would this affect the thermal plant in Brandon, Manitoba?
We do have an east-west electricity grid, but it needs more interties, it needs to be modernized, it needs to work so that you can actually get, for instance, Quebec hydropower into all the Maritimes. There should be, and yes, any plant currently operating burning coal or fracked LNG would be translated very quickly into being shut down by 2030 or there's no use for a thermal plant in the context of a 100% green east-west electricity grid.
Thank you. I'd really like to focus in on the home refits. I'm going by memory. It's something like 80% of the national housing stock was built before 1980, like my house.
Yeah.
Who pays for this? And it sounds compulsory under the National Building Code, which means when I go to transfer title or sell, when I go to the old reporter's home, that my home must meet code. Who pays?
The goal here is to have the 30% of greenhouse gases that currently come from leaky buildings in Canada stopped up by having them be energy efficient, and better if they actually are producing their own energy from solar panels so that you actually have your building producing energy. And this is also universities, schools, hospitals. So there's an incentivized program, and it's also related to your income capacity. We need to make sure, and we also will be unleashing millions of skilled tradespeople to do this work. It is a big job. It will need, I think, also engaging groups like Habitat for Humanity to undertake making sure that low-income housing is now completely 100% energy efficient, which
5 minutes, forgive me.
okay, but that reduces.
So it sounds like it's compulsory at the homeowner's expense with some.
No, I did not say that.
Well, who's going to pay?
There'll be government funding related to need of those who own the building. Those who, if it's a tax incentive for a certain level of homeowner income, that's appropriate. If it's low-income housing, we make sure it gets done. This is not, and as I said, the details and the budgeting will come with our platform.
I've done 2 home energy retrofits, and the savings come
How
from
much did you spend?
probably around $15,000.
$5,000.
Yep,
What
yep.
was the footage of the home?
It was 1,600 square foot.
Okay, so it's
Yeah.
a pretty small house, and it
Yeah.
was a fairly new house, or was this the
Built in 1910.
Okay.
Yep. And so the savings come with, it comes over time, but the subsidies at the time, there were federal and provincial subsidies to be able to go forward and do that, and the energy savings,
I understand, Mr.
yeah.
Reynolds. So that's the template then?
yeah.
No, well,
Could I
Well,
ask
that's
a
part of the
question?
template, yeah.
At the moment, we've got targets of 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. We're not meeting them. More than 50% in a recent poll in Alberta are upset with the Federation.
Yeah.
Don't you think this is a real threat to national unity?
no, this is something to pull us together. This is the first time that we're saying to all Canadians, this is something we have to do together. We're saying to Albertans, we're not out to get your sector. We will use your oil as long as we're using oil, and over time we'll shift production. And I know that this was already in the plans of the previous Alberta government to use bitumen as more of a feedstock to petrochemical production. We cannot continue to pretend that we are in a status quo world where significant changes aren't coming. Canadians have more in common than we have in the difference. We have to pull together. This is all hands on deck. And the reality is the federal government has tools in its toolbox that it hasn't even opened and looked at. Look at Part 4 of CEPA. The Ministry of Environment has all the powers that are required to regulate every single plant across Canada that's producing greenhouse gases. Earlier this morning at the Green PAC meeting, Catherine McKenna said that Brian Mulroney tackled acid rain through pricing it. That's not correct. He tackled acid rain through agreements with each individual province that involved regulations more than it involved pricing. So we need to use the tools we have, and the federal government has plenty of them. We have, nous avons la carotte et aussi le bâton. So toujours, nous avons utilisé les deux. So we have the carrot, we can help with tax benefits, we can help with subsidies. We can say to service clubs, how many trees do you want to plant? We'll send you the trees, you go plant them. Right now, British Columbia, with all the fires we've had, no one is replanting where those wildfires burned. No one is thinking about the standing dead timber that's right there waiting to be fuel for future fires. No one's going in and cutting fire blocks. We need to take this seriously because it's a serious threat to our immediate future, and it's a threat to our kids' survival. So I think that Canadians, and I believe Albertans, absolutely care about a future that's fair, that we don't want any one region of the country suffering more than any other region of the country. But we need to pull together, and we need to do this.
So just so I'm clear, you don't want to leave oil in the ground. You think
Yes, we will leave oil in the ground. There'll be no new fossil fuel developments, no fracking, no new oil wells. The existing level of production in the oil sands, which is close to a little bit more than 2 million barrels of oil a day, we would not exceed that. But as long as we're producing 2 million barrels of bitumen a day, and it would be on a declining basis towards 2050, we would be using that in Canada. That would be the market. Now, we don't turn off the taps to imported oil overnight because there needs to be adjustments, as we've talked about, to refineries, to supply, to adequate distribution networks to ensure that the oil reaches, that the refined product reach the markets in Eastern Canada, as well as in Alberta and in BC. But
level of production, I'm still unclear about how you get emissions down.
well, coal, let's just give you one example back to Alberta. Alberta's coal-fired power plants for TransAlta's electricity grid within Alberta produces the same amount of greenhouse gases as the oil sands, about 70 million tons a year. So if you shut all the coal down in Alberta and you don't replace it under the Notley Climate Plan, the plan was to replace it with fracked natural gas with the same carbon footprint as coal. So you lose your chance to have a huge reduction in emissions in Alberta by eliminating burning coal for electricity and replacing it with only renewable. Alberta is the province in this country with the best potential for solar power. And the existing nuclear plants can continue, but nuclear is a loser on the economics. Takes far too much money, very capital intensive to finally build a reactor. We have to move faster. So the existing plants are, for their lifetime, I wouldn't put any money into retubing and trying to get them to last longer. Because frankly, right now, solar power, new solar power, is cheaper than coal. New solar power is way cheaper than nuclear. So when we look at our energy future, we can have smiles on our faces. This is not bad news, that renewable energy is now proven, reliable, and cheaper. One of our big hiccups is battery storage, which is why we want partnerships, particularly with First Nations in any area where we can get pumped storage into, for instance, abandoned quarry pits, existing reservoirs. This is not pie in the sky stuff. Norway does it with Denmark all the time. Denmark has excess wind power, sells it to Norway. Norway uses it to pump water up into existing reservoirs. That is a battery. That stores the energy for when you need it. Then Norway lets the sluices go. And I'm sorry if this is confusing, but so easy.
Would you be able to do all this is fight this war on climate change and balance the books?
Very
Yes.
quickly.
Otherwise, the budget that we're going to present that goes with our platform, which we're putting forward to the Parliamentary Budget Office for review, we will not be able to eliminate the deficit in our first year, but we will be eliminating Canada's deficit faster than other parties. And if we don't get that through the Parliamentary Budget Office, which we're still working with them, it's an iterative process. I will not run in the 2019 election for the Green Party. Our platform will be reviewed by PBO and acceptable to them as a sound fiscal framework.
If it's not, you won't run?
Well, no, what I'm saying is, as leader of the party, I will assure you right now that our platform is going to be costed, fiscally responsible, and achieve what needs to be done so our kids have a livable world. It means finding more revenue. It does not mean austerity. It means finding new sources of revenue so that we can balance our books more quickly And basically, the bottom line is we have the Liberals and the New Democrats telling us they understand it's a climate emergency, but they're not prepared to answer a simple question like, so do you shut down the Kitimat LNG plant, which is a huge source of new greenhouse gases? We have the Liberals telling us that it's a climate emergency, but they want to build the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, and they will not cut fossil fuel subsidies. We need to actually be dedicated, serious, and responsible leaders in this country so that we can be leaders in the world.
Thank you. There'll be interviews outside.
Yeah, I'll keep going outside. I'm sorry about
Apparently it's the style they choose. I know, it's crazy.
It's like a rematch, actually.